Now we are going to add controller in this web API application. So let's add the controller in this application. So for adding controller, first of all, let's add a new folder for this application. So I'm going to create a new folder by the name of controller. We can see, right? And inside this folder, I'm going to create one simple class. So let's create one simple class by the name home. And remember one thing, that we need to define suffix for defining any controller in the web API application, right? So I have done so. So I have defined home controller. Any meaningful name we can give. So at this point of time, I have taken home controller. Let's click on add button. Now we have defined the home controller class. And now I'm going to make this class inheritable. So I'm going to inherit this class from the controller base class, right? And for the resolving this namespace, we can see this is coming from microsoft.aspnetcore.mvc. In the top, you can see this namespace. That means this class is available in this namespace, right? So now we have inherited this home controller class from the controller base class. Now let's add API attribute controller, and for adding API controller attribute, we need to define it in the square bracket on the top of the controller, right? So we have also defined the API controller attribute. And now let's simply add one simple method. Let's say it is going to return any string, and we can define any meaningful method name, right? And let's say we are returning a message from this method. We can write hello from web API and then the, let's say, method name, right? Save the changes. So till now what we have done, we have simply added one controller by the name of home controller class, right? And we have made this controller class inherited from the controller base class, and we have added API controller attribute, and now we are going to access this resource. Remember, when we are working with the web API, all the action methods, whatever we are defining in a particular controller, those are called resource, right? So now we want to access this particular resource. For accessing this particular resource, we need to define routing, right? So let's say in the browser, when the application loads, we want to access this particular resource, so we need to define the URL in the browser, right? And for defining the mapping in the routing, we need to define routing over here on the top of the controller class by the keyword route. That means now it is having routing. Let's define routing by the name. Let's say we are going to pass this URL in the browser. Let's copy this. Now say now let's save the changes. Now I'm running the application. Now we are going to access this resource with the help of this routing in the browser, right? So let's save the changes. Let's run the application. Application has been loaded successfully. It will give 404. Yes, because nothing is defined in the URL, right? So we need to define. So in the, let's say in the URL, we need to pass employee, and let press enter. We can see the response. We can see the message, hello from web API get data. And from where we are getting it? From this action method or from this resource, right? So this is how we can access a resource, particular resource in the browser by passing the URL, right? And how we have defined this URL? We have defined this URL in the routing table, that is called this attribute routing. At this point of time, if you are not getting about this routing, don't worry. In the upcoming videos, we will be discussing in a very detail how we can deal with the attribute routing. But at this point of time, simply understand that we want to access this particular resource. So that's why we have defined the routing on the top of this controller, right? Now let's say, let me stop the application. Now let's create one more access, sorry, one more resource. So let's create one more resource over here, and now let's name this get employee data, right? And let's pass it over here. Now we want to access this particular resource, right? So let's save the changes. Now let's run the application and see now what going to happen in the browser. So let's wait. Yes, so we can see we are getting the 404 error. So let's we need to pass the URL in the browser, and let's say we are passing employee, right? Pressing the enter. Now it is giving HTTP error 500. So this is not giving a meaningful message. So for defining the meaningful message, let's for that we need to add a exception page in the application. And for adding the exception page in the application, we need to define it in our startup class. So let's go to the startup class, and over here we can see over here. Let's define the environment. Environment is development, right? And inside this we are going to add developer exception piece over here for this application. Now save the changes. If somehow if any error is coming on this is development, that means you need to import the namespace. You can see microsoft.extension.hosting. So you can get it and you can resolve the namespace, then you will not get the error. So I have simply added a developer exception piece for the application. Now save the changes. Now run the application, go to the home controller. Now run the application. And now when I will pass the URL in the browser by the name employee, let's copy this, right? And let's run the application. Yeah, our application has been run successfully. We need to define the URL. We need to define URL in the browser. So let's paste it. Now we can see application got confused. Although we have passed the employee controller name in the URL, but the application got confused to which action method does it need to call, right? Whether it has to call get data or get employee data. We can see in the code also we are having two resources, get data or get employee data. So application got confused to which resource it has to call in the browser, right? You can see ambiguous match exception. The request matched multiple endpoints. So along with this controller name, we need to define the action name also, or we can say we need to define the resource also. So for that, let's go to the code. Let me stop the application, right? You are getting my point. So now along with this controller name, sorry, along with this, yeah, whatever we are passing this employee, so we need to define action action name also. So we need to pass in the attribute routing along with this employee, we need to pass the action method name to which action method it has to call, right? So let's save the changes. Now let's run the application. Now along with the this employee, we need to define the action method name also to access any particular resources, right? So let's pass it. Now if I'm pressing enter, you can see it is giving this 404. Now we need to define our action method name. Now we can see we are getting the response hello from web API data. Web API get data, the same the same message from this get data. And now if we are passing this action method name to access this resource, so let pass it. Now press enter. We can see hello from web API get employee data. So we are able to call a specific resource, or we can say we are able to access a specific resource according to our need, right? So this is how we define the routing in the application. So we can add multiple action methods inside this controller, and we can access a particular resource by defining this URL in the browser, right? By defining this URL in the browser, your employee name and then the corresponding action method name, and the controller will hit that particular action method name, right? So this is how we can see that we can deal with the controller, and we can create the controller, and we can access particular resources by defining this API controller attribute and the route, this your routing in your application, right?